Yes, solid wood and composite materials. Thank you, Colby. When I'm referring to solid wood, I'm talking about wood. When I'm referring to composite materials or plywood or anything like that, well, when I'm referring to composites, I'm talking about plywood or MDF. Anything where the wood has been manipulated to the point that glue has been introduced or a chemical has been introduced into it. Any kind of processed wood like that, I'm not going to refer to as solid. So you'll notice, for example, in the machine room, we have various bins sitting out. So there's one that's for usable hardwood scraps. And that shouldn't be plywood or MDF or anything like that. Hardwood, solid wood. And then there's a plywood bin for usable plywood scraps. And then there's our trash, and the trash is divided into burnables, which are only solid woods, and then trash, which are going to be the composites as well. So we don't burn any of the things that have chemicals introduced into them for obvious reasons, because it's going to be really bad for your health, having burning glue, coming out into the atmosphere. So just be aware that's a thing. I did touch on briefly last time that the other thing that we do in here is not permit any softwoods, right? So that's a good place to begin. Let's talk about the difference between hardwoods and softwoods and why that is an important difference to make here. So of course hardwoods, we already talked about this, hardwoods come from deciduous trees, and softwoods come from conifers for the most part. There are, of course, there's almost always an exception to every rule in woodworking, but the main difference between these two species of tree has to do with its sort of hibernation cycle, as it were. Hardwoods, or deciduous trees, of course, in the fall and in the winter, they lose their leaves. They kind of go into a state of dormancy. And then in the spring, they wake up again, and then they, kind of come back to life. Conifers, on the other hand, or evergreens, as it were, no, they don't do that. They retain their needles the entire time, and they stay in more or less a state of growth perpetually. I'm oversimplifying it by a lot, but for the function of what we're talking about here, it's an ample enough description. The reason that conifers are able to do that is because the sap that runs in them is that gooey pitch, right? Everyone's seen it. Pine sap is gross. But it doesn't ever really harden, and it doesn't ever really stop being produced. If you think about, if you're making maple syrup, for example, and you're tapping the tree to get the maple sap out, think about how liquid that is. Has everybody seen that kind of a thing? It's not thick. The syrup that you end up with in the end has been really, really massively reduced to give it that level of viscosity. When it first comes out of the tree, it's extremely liquid. That's kind of the main difference. It's this liquid that turns on and off with the seasons, as it were, as opposed to something that has this liquid that, because of its viscosity, stays viable even into cold temperatures. So that pitch, like I was saying, ruins our blades. It just destroys them. It coats everything, it burns, it gets really hot. When it burns, it tends to take the temper off of a tool. So it starts being super dull in addition to being filthy. All of the things that are a giant pain in the butt. So we just don't use it. Similarly, we also don't use any pressure-treated lumber in here. More for the chemical reason than for the pine reason, although usually pressure-treated lumber also happens to be pine. So if you have any questions about what can or cannot be used in here, just ask. Although for the most part, my rule is that unless it comes from the wood room itself, it's probably not permissible, unless you've got a special dispensation from me for it. So hardwoods, they've got that period of dormancy. They still follow their life cycle, like the regular life cycle, and that's the wood movement that I'm talking about. Was that a question? Okay. So, you know, they wake up in the spring and they're like, oh, hey, the weather's getting warm. I'm gonna make some leaves and I'm gonna do my thing. And that's exactly what they do. They wake up, they make leaves, they do their thing. And they start to grow. Everyone has seen annular growth rings in a cross-section of a tree, right? Right away in the spring, the tree is like, woo, here we go, we're growing. I'm taking in all my nutrients, there's a lot of rain. And it puts out one big layer. And then towards the end of the summer, it's like, oh, all right, well, maybe I'm gonna slow it down a little bit. And then it shuts the whole thing down, stops really doing too much sap production, and everything that it's produced all spring and summer, it lives off of during the fall and winter. And then in the spring again, it starts all over again. It's like a hibernating bear. It's not like it dies, it just goes dormant. I bring that up though because that directly relates to the anatomy of wood, right? So when we're talking about wood and the usable portions of it, of course we're talking about the trunk, right? Trunk and sometimes major limbs, but for the most part we're talking about the trunk. By and large, when you're using a piece of wood, you're taking something out of the length of it, right? This should be fairly obvious for most people, but just to give you a background in case it's not fairly obvious, it is intro to woodworking, you know, why not? Let's make it as fundamental as possible. The thing about the way that wood is structured is that the fibers themselves that make up the wood are longer than they are wide. So like if you look at this, this is a chunk of a piece of red oak that came out of a tree that fell in my backyard at my last place. And I mean, look at it, it almost looks like a crystal. There you go. That's why when you get a splinter, it's this long, thin thing. The cells themselves are long and thin. And, you know, I think this is really kind of incredible in terms of really explain the structure of the material. So the cells are long and thin like that because it helps to keep the tree upright, as it were. The trees themselves are pretty heavy, right? And you have to have this material that's not going to want to break. And so as a result, that material structurally is like this. Makes sense. And they're all kind of glued together next to each other. Getting a little ahead of myself though. Let's talk about the actual parts of the tree. So when the tree grows, of course, it starts with a little sapling, right? Oh, that tiny little sapling is going to become the center of the tree. It may seem fairly obvious, but every year that a tree is alive, it puts another layer on the outside. It doesn't like push the inner layer out. It adds to the outside of the tree, right? So that very tiny center part that started as a sapling is referred to as the pith, P-I-T-H. The pith can be kind of problematic when it comes to the structure of a board that's usable, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Of course, every year that this grows, it's going to put on a visible growth ring. Depending on the species of the tree, the growth rings are going to be more visible than others. But what you're going to see is kind of clear rings, right? The thing is that the inside of that, like the space from here to the outside of this one here, that's 1 year's worth of growth. See what I'm saying? And what it is it's early growth and it's late growth, like what I was talking about. That spring and summertime when it's like, yeah, baby, let's do this. I've got all the nutrients and sunlight that I need. That's when it puts on the wider part of the ring. That's the early growth. And then it kind of seals it up a little bit with the late growth. Functionally, that's not exactly how it works, but again, just visualize with me. So early growth and late growth, and that the combination of those two layers, then that produces a single year's worth of growth, right? As the tree gets older, the wood on the inside gets darker and less moisture filled. The whole idea is that these growth rings, they do a bunch of different things. One, they help conduct moisture, but mostly what's happening is that those inside layers are storage. There's storage for sugars and carbohydrates for it to use during the winter. And it's also moisture storage as well, right? So as the tree gets older and older, it's more important as the tree gets bigger, not that those interior layers are serving as storage, but that they're serving as structure. The bigger the tree gets, the stronger it has to be. So those inside bits get harder and have a lower moisture content than the outside bits. So the best, look at this. Do you see the color difference between the inside of this and the outside? This is a piece of cherry. This is what's referred to as heartwood versus sapwood. I'm going to draw that up there in just a second so you'll be able to have it. Is that even visible on here? Just barely. I need a higher contrast chalk. Problem is my white chalk is horrible in the sense that that is more visible. It scratches, makes a horrible sound. So those inner layers end up being much darker, and then these outer layers are lighter in color. They also tend to be softer as a result. They're more porous, they're more permeable. The whole idea is that that the tree is storing the sap in that sap layer. And then the heartwood layer is the one that's making sure the tree stays upright, more or less. Make sense? Yeah, more or less. I'm generalizing some pretty, broad and specific bits of physics and chemistry, but for our purposes, this is probably as specific as it needs to be for you guys to understand. Now, right here, here's where it becomes extra important, right? There's one pretty hardcore living layer right at the very edge of the sapwood and on the inside of the bark here. And it does a couple of different things. So, let's see. This layer right here, it's right at that break. It's only a few cells thick, and it's referred to as the cambium. The cambium is it is the most important layer of living material in the tree. If you destroy the cambium all the way around a tree, you'll kill it. It's what's referred to as girdling. Part of the reason why beavers are so problematic, they'll girdle a tree. And what that does is it essentially suffocates the tree. It stops the roots from being able to transmit moisture up to the leaves, and it stops the leaves from being able to bring nutrients all the way down. It's bad stuff. So the cambium, ultra important. It's the primary vascular system for the tree, and it also produces all of the other layers that we are talking about here. So here, I'll label this a bit better. Heartwood. So not hardwood, but heartwood and sapwood, the lighter colored stuff. And then the cambium. So if you're ever taking the bark off of the tree and the bark just wants to peel off right at this one spot, that's that cambium layer right there. And you can see even on this little dude here, the bark is bubbling right there. It's bubbling at the cambium. Right? Beautiful thing. So what does the cambium do exactly, apart from the fact that it puts takes the moisture and moves it around and does all of those things? Well, it's got, like I said, it has sort of two main cellular layers. The one on the outside produces bark. So from here we got a couple of different layers going on. Obviously, the very outside of the bark is referred to as the outer bark. And this serves to protect the tree. It's its skin, more or less. But those cellular layers have to continually be, renewed so that the tree can stay protected. Inside of that, there is, wait for it, the inner bark. And the inner bark is that cellular layer that's producing the outer bark. Kind of keeps pushing out. The cambium also, so the cambium is producing that inner bark on the one side, and on the other side of its layer, it's producing those growth ring cells. So it's the area that's like making everything, it's making the tree. The cambium builds the tree. So that's why it's so friggin' important. Outer bark. Let's say inner bark. Sometimes the inner bark layer can be really pretty substantial and spongy. You know, you'll see it like that. It just depends on the species of tree. Inner bark. So what does this have to do with what we know as woodworkers? Well, parts of this material is going to be more usable than other parts, ultimately, is what it comes down to. Because the sapwood is not as dark and not as hard, we tend to not like to use it. Woodworkers, by and large, are looking to use the heartwood as opposed to the sapwood of a tree. So there's that aspect of it. So heartwood is desirable. Heartwood is most used. But then there's the physics of the material too. Remember how I said that wood never stops moving? Wood moves? Well, wood moves in a very predictable way. Thank God. If it wasn't predictable, we would be screwed. But it moves very, very predictably. Wood expands and contracts seasonally, right? Everybody has probably noticed how in the summer, like your doors swell and you can't open them up, that kind of thing, or whatever. In the summertime, when the moisture level is higher, typically speaking, the wood is going to expand. It's going to take in more moisture and it's going to get bigger. And then during the winter or when it's drier, it loses that moisture and it contracts. What's interesting is that wood tends to do this regardless of actual ambient moisture. So if you're in a perfectly climate controlled thing, the wood's still going to move because it just remembers. It's crazy. It's like, yeah, I was a tree once, I'm just going to swell up a little bit. You're like, okay. And of course, environmentally, if it's really exposed to a lot of, moisture, it's going to do that a lot. But like I said, it does it predictably. So it does it cyclically. Let's see. Predictable movement. Cyclical. You know that in the summer it's going to be more so, in the winter it's going to be less so. It also does not expand and contract along its length. It is dimensionally fixed along its length. Remember, when we're talking about the length of the material, we're talking about along the trunk, which is how most boards come out anyway. You can almost always assume that when I'm talking about the length of a board, I'm talking about the grain running, in that direction. So, fixed along, oh, that's confusing to read. The length. The analogy I like to use is if you take a roll of toilet paper and accidentally drop it in the toilet, it gets wet, right? It doesn't get taller, but it sure does get bigger this way, right? That is what wood does as its moisture content changes. It's like, and then, but it doesn't get bigger this way. I'm trying to think of the next most logical way of describing this. There's sort of two other things that go into this predictability. Let's talk, fixed along its length. Here's the other thing. It moves along the growth rings. That's the other thing, is it's not just that it gets wider and smaller, parallel to, or perpendicular to its growth direction. It's that movement happens along the growth rings, specifically. So as something expands and contracts, if there's more growth ring kind of being exposed, that's the thing that dictates wood movement. So it moves along the growth rings. This becomes really important when it comes to the cut of the wood, which we're going to get to in just a minute. And then lastly, its rate of expansion and contraction is almost always a fixed proportion. So I'm going to touch on that briefly and we'll come back to it. So it's a fixed proportion. So I'm just mentioning it now, but we'll actually talk about that in a minute. So everybody have this diagram? Yeah? Okay. Might move you forward a little bit just to make sure that you can see what's happening here. Yes. Okay. All right. So if the wood moves along the growth rings, there are ways that you can cut the wood that are going to yield a more stable product or not. And in fact, you can see here that this thing is split, right? That's because it moves along the growth rings. There are smaller amounts of growth ring towards the center versus greater amounts towards the outside. It literally has more movement in it on the outside than it does on the inside as a result. That's why it splits like this. Those rings are like, I'm going to tear this apart. It's part of the reason why the pith can become kind of problematic. The pith essentially doesn't want to move. It becomes like a pivot point for the material around it. So frequently what will happen when wood is being processed is that the pith section gets taken out completely, depending on the species of wood. But you can get kind of close to it. It's pretty incredible. In terms of cuts of wood, I will do my best to illustrate this clearly. It'll be a little hunky, but you know. And that does not. Come on. Ah, God. This white chalk is the worst. There we go. All right, here's our tree again, right? With our center and our growth rings. Very commonly, people would take this to the mill and just slice it. Just slice, actually. Slice. Right? Boom, 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 boom. So it's the cheapest and easiest way to process a tree, ultimately, because it's just like, it's one thing, right? What this yields is a cut of wood that's referred to as flat sawn or plain sawn lumber. Most of what you're going to find in the wood room is going to be flat sawn or plain sawn. It's going to yield a board that, let's see, that looks like this. Here's the end of the board. This is the thickness of it and its length. So here are my growth rings, right? The center of the tree is somewhere like that. Does this make sense so far? What you're seeing here? The rings themselves, you know, it gives that like wood grain look that everybody knows so well. You know, kind of rings and arches and stuff like that. That is what that board is going to look like along its face. Much, much more importantly, though, is that that tree, or that board, is going to want to pull away from the center. That board right there is going to turn into this board. It's going to cut. Because once it's been cut loose from all of its surrounding material, suddenly those rings are able to move. They're able to do what they want, and they're no longer constrained by their brothers. And so when you cut the wood apart, all of a sudden the wood's like, woo! Yeah! Freedom. That's a thing. And it happens very, very predictably. The board will pull away from the center every time. That doesn't mean that it's like faulty or that there's any problem with it. It just is the board doing what the board's going to do. It moves along the growth rings, and those growth rings pull away from the middle. So how can I get a board that's not going to do that? What if I want the most stable cut of wood in the world? What am I going to look for? Anybody? Construction guys, any thoughts on what's a stable cut of wood? No? Well, if I've got my tree again, oh God, why? This one also bad? Yep. Let's see. Whatever. You get the idea. If I want the most stable cut of wood that I can get, I want something that's going to be cut perpendicular across those growth rings. It's what's referred to as quarter sawn lumber. If I took a board out of that right there, ooh, baby. Then I would have a board that looks like this on the end, growth rings nice and tight, yeah? And the board itself, the face of it's going to be really tightly striped because I'm cutting across all of those growth rings. Okay? This is referred to as quarter sawn. And the reason is that the tree itself is typically quartered in order to make that happen. You cut like that, and you cut like that, and you cut like that. Truly quarter sawn logs, tend to be sort of radially done like this. It's a very ridiculous process. Most of the time what actually happens is they cut a couple like this, and then they cut a couple like this, and then they cut a couple like that. And that yields the last most common form of cut. Flat sawing actually yields this cut of wood as well, but not with as much yield, as it were. A board that has, sort of like a board that comes from like right about here, right? Looks like that on the end. It's still going to yield you some parallel stripes, but they're going to be spaced further apart. That's what's referred to as rift sawn lumber. The beauty of rift sawing is it's a little more stable than the flat sawing, and it tends to expose radial cells. Most of the time you don't see the radial cells in most woods. They're very, very small. Most of the cells, of course, run up and down. Those are the fibers, but they're the ones that run out, inside to outside, that actually help to transfer the sugars from those storage cells out to the cambium. Those radial cells, depending on the cut of wood, can be extremely attractive and very decorative. If you think about oak, rift sawn oak exposes all of those radial cells, and they kind of stripe and do all this other stuff. Sycamore, when it's cut that way, is ridiculous looking. It's got this crazy zigzag thing. So the cut of the wood dictates two things, mostly, that are going to matter to us. It dictates how it's going to look and how it's going to move, right? So knowing that when you're picking your lumber really helps. The flat sawn ones are going to move the most, and they're going to pull away. The quarter sawn ones are going to move the least because they're moving like that. I mean, think about it. Equal amounts across the whole thing. It's beautiful. Quarter sawn lumber is the way to go. However, because it costs so much more to produce in terms of getting wood that's cut that way in the first place, it tends to be much, much more expensive. And as a result, I don't usually buy it for the class. There are ways that you can make quarter sawn wood, but we'll talk about that later down the line. With the rift sawn, it is still going to move this way, and it's going to distort. So it'll probably cup similarly to the flat sawn, but not as dramatically, and it's going to distort in kind of a diamond shape. Just a little bit. But you know what? Wood moves. That's what it does. It's not a question of stopping the wood from doing that. It's a question of working with doing that, So these are your predictors right here. What is the cut of the wood? all that good stuff. I'm going to erase this in just a second, so make sure you've all got it there, okay? So like I was saying before, if we look at this list of the predictable things there, heartwood, predictable movement, cyclical, fixed along its length, moves along the growth rings, and therefore the cut is extra important. And then fixed proportion. So depending on the species of wood that you're using, the rate of expansion and contraction is going to be a little bit different from one species to the next. There are some that move a lot, and there are some that don't move very much at all. By and large, you can use a single proportion, though, to kind of estimate for everything, okay? And that is for every foot of width that a board has. So here's my board. For every 12 inches, Sarah cannot spell. For every 12 inches of width. And this is, of course, for like the least stable cut of wood you can have. This is going to be for a flat sawn board. For every foot of width, cyclically over the course of the year, it will move by 1/8 of an inch. It will either, gain 1/8 or lose 1/8 or whatever, but it's going to change its dimension by 1/8 of an inch. Right? So why is this important? Well, if I'm building something and I've got, let's say I've got a foot of wood that I have glued into a frame completely, and it's solid wood, and the frame around it is completely solid, and the grain changes direction in that frame all the way around it. Over the course of that year, that center board is going to expand by 1/8 of an inch, and it's going to break those joints. Anything that's trying to hold it in place across that way, it's going to break it. If I have got a solid table, for example, and the tabletop is glued to the base, and the base is, runs in different directions, as that tabletop moves, it's either going to break the base apart or the base is going to tear the top apart. That's frequently why you see cracks in broad areas like that, is because it's been artificially attached to something in a way that's not going to allow the wood to move. So everything that we do, construction-wise, is predicated on making sure that the piece does not tear itself apart over the course of a couple of years as it moves through its cycle. That's why most construction methods for furniture have not changed in literally thousands of years, is because wood does this stuff, and you just got to roll with it and figure out how to make that stuff work, how to let it do its thing without just sort of, not interfering at all. So to that end, we have joinery methods that work with this. So, but yes, this is all to say wood moves. Wood moves. Wood moves. All right, so there's our predictability scale. Anybody have any questions at this point? So wood is a natural fiber. Let's talk about how it actually comes to become a usable thing, right? So, somebody fells a tree, right? The tree gets cut apart to become boards of a specific thickness. Traditionally speaking, what would be done is the boards would be split into whatever they were going to be, and then left to dry. A living tree has, I forget what the moisture content is, but some crazy amount of moisture. And there's moisture all the way through into the heartwood. It's not doing as much as the sapwood is doing in terms of storage, but it's still, it has a lot of moisture in it. What you have to do is you have to allow that moisture to work its way out of the board until it hits this neutral state, a point where it's like not going to take on really anymore or lose anymore, and that's about 12%. So a fully cured piece of hardwood has 12% moisture content, give or take. If it gets down a little bit lower than that, then you got a really, really dry piece of wood. If it's just a little too high, then, you know, it hasn't fully cured up yet. Back in the day, that drying was produced by cutting the boards apart, stickering them. This is an important term as well, stickering. I'll explain in just a second. And then letting them dry for a year for every inch of thickness that the board had. So if you have a slab wood that's 2 inches thick and you want it to be usable, it has to sit there for 2 years for the moisture to be able to work its way out. So, you know, here's my tree, whatever. I got my boards, and the boards will be up on little sticks. This is one board, right? These stickers, these are what are referred to as stickers, go between every layer to allow the air to move around each board. So, and they're stacked right on top of each other. So if you're looking at it in profile, it'd be like, and then there's another set of stickers, and then the next board. The reason for this is that it distributes the weight evenly all the way down, and you don't get boards that are going to be distorted that way, right? The whole idea between this is to keep it so that every surface has air moving around it, and it's as stable as possible. Once you've got your boards cut down like that, and they're being stickered, and they're being dried, you just have to make sure that they're not exposed to the elements too much. People tend to do drying, they're drying outside, under a shed. So they'll, you know, put it under a shed, maybe they'll tarp the thing, but they'll let it sit for a couple of seasons until that moisture has worked its way down. The other really key part of that is that they seal up the end grain. So when we're talking about wood, the faces of the boards are what's referred to as face grain. Right? Even on the edge there, that'll also be considered face grain because it's, you know, it's the face of those long fibers. But those fibers, when you cut across them, it's like cutting into a straw. It's, you know, it's essentially open at that point, right? So you're going to gain and lose moisture from your end grain a hell of a lot faster than you are from your face grain. The face grain, the moisture has to literally kind of work its way through the cell walls to be able to evaporate out. On the ends, it's just like, there, I'm free, it's cool. So you seal up the end grain in order to force the moisture to have to work its way out through the face grain. That's why you tend to see boards that have been painted on the ends, right? It's like that paint seals up those straws. And it's like, okay, cool. It doesn't completely seal it up. You tend to see the ends of the boards have cracks in them frequently. If you take a look at log over here, see how it has all these cracks in it? Any kind of crack in a board is referred to as a check. That board is badly checked, means it has a lot of cracks in it. So cracks, checks. So when we're getting lumber and we're using it, you tend to check the ends for checking, literally. How badly checked are the ends? That refers to how far up into it the cracks run, that kind of thing. So, you know, proper nomenclature helps a lot when it comes to like buying your lumber, right? So your ends, they're gonna crack, the cracks are gonna kind of run up. Depending on how far they go depends on how much usable wood you've got. Generally speaking, when I'm buying wood to use, I assume that the last 4 inches, at least 4 to 5 inches of every board is probably going to be unusable because the ends are going to have these microchecks in them that I'm not necessarily going to see until I cut into it. But I just assume if I've got an 8-foot board, I probably only have 7 feet, maybe 4 inches of usable stock between those ends. See what I'm saying? Because the ends just get right? So here's the thing, air drying like this is obviously extremely costly and it takes forever. So how does industry meet the needs for everybody's lumber without having to air dry everything? Well, the answer is they put it in a drying kiln. Most of the wood that you are going to ever work with has been kiln dried. And what that does is it takes the wood up to a certain temperature, it kind of works the moisture out of it as a result. It turns it into steam. The steam forces its way out the ends, or at the faces, and then, whatever. It takes a process that would normally take several years, potentially, and it turns it into something that's only going to take several months, if that, sometimes several weeks, depending on the cut and type. The benefit of that is that we have inexpensive lumber that we have access to that has a stable amount of moisture in it to make it workable. There are drawbacks though, major drawbacks to kiln dried lumber as opposed to air dried lumber. And that's mostly that it's cooked. We have cooked the wood. The fibers of the wood are held together with a chemical called lignin, Lignin. When you heat a lignin bond, it becomes soft and movable a little bit. When you kiln dry lumber, what you do is you essentially cook those bonds and it changes their chemical composition and it turns them colors. So a piece of air-dried walnut, for example, is purple and pink and gray and blue and red and gorgeous. And a piece of kiln-dried walnut is brown. This is brown. So you're taking away a lot of the color and workability of wood when it's kiln dried as opposed to air dried. It's like a totally different beast. But frankly, it's so expensive to get your hands on air dried lumber, most of the time you guys will never work with it. The couple of times I've had that opportunity, it's been, I dream about it still. Like, air dried lumber is amazing. It's just amazing. It's like butter. But, it's what is. It's what is. It doesn't radically change the working properties of some really fast-growing woods, like poplar. You guys are going to use a lot of poplar in this class. It's an extremely fast-growing tree. Almost every part of it that gets harvested can be used. The bark gets used for shingles a lot. And then the wood itself is reasonably stable and extremely sustainable. When you kiln dry poplar, it doesn't change it much, frankly. It's just like, okay. It's only when you get up into like the really, 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 really nice, thicker pieces of American hardwoods that becomes an issue. If you want, later I can show you the difference between a piece of air-dried versus kiln-dried walnut. I have some in my office, and it's like night and day. You wouldn't think they were the same thing at all. But anyway, so you're going to use kiln-dried no matter what. It's okay. It's not a big deal. But anyway. So that leads me then to talking about units of volume, right? How I said a board that's 1 inch thick would have to sit for a year, and a board that's 2 inches thick would have to sit for 2 years, etc., etc. Well, we don't refer to thickness of lumber in inches. We refer to it in quarter inches. I know, it doesn't make any sense at all, but it's what it is. So, a board that is 1 inch thick is what's referred to as a 4-quarter board. Now, this does not mean that the board itself is actually 1 inch thick. That means that when it was harvested, it was cut at such a thickness that it should yield a 1 inch thick board. Frequently it means it's a little bit bigger than that. Sometimes it's a little bit smaller than that. So it's a rough amount. It's not a specific thing. It's that kind of milled goal, right? 2 inches, of course, would be what then? 8 what?
8/4.
Very good. 8/4. You'll notice it's referred to as a singular quarter. 8/4, 4/4, etc. 8/4. 3 inches is what?
12/4.
12/4, yes. Etc. I have in the wood room up to 16/4 lumber, which is 4 inches thick. Only in one species, mind you. But these are the most common that you're going to see. And remember, a 12/4 board, after it's been put through its milling processes, which we're going to talk about next time, you're not going to end up with a board that's 3 inches thick. You're probably going to end up with a board that's 2 7/8, or maybe even 2 3/4, depending. So when you start thinking about your projects, if you're like, well, I want this board to be an inch thick, your 4/4 board might not yield an inch of material. It might yield less than that. This is just for determining like what it was cut into roughly in order to cure it and sell it. Because selling it, we'll talk about that in a second. All right, so this is important in terms of reference for thickness. We also, very, very specifically, when we're talking about wood volumes, in this class, and actually in woodworking in general, we don't refer to lengths in feet at all. We only use inches. So something isn't 8 feet, it's 96 inches, okay? So remember that. I don't want to know that it's 4'2", I want to know that it's 50 inches. Make sense? So length is referred to, length is inches. Width is inches. Thickness is 1/4 inches. Right? So if I've got a board that is, let's see, it's 50 by 5.5 by 4/4, that is the way I would describe that board in terms of its dimensions. Length, width, thickness. Doesn't matter if it's in that order, but that's usually how I do it. The length of the board is pretty much always going to be, like I said, along the length of the tree itself, just because of the material, right? But when I ask you how thick your board is, I'm not asking you how wide your board is. Like, this is going to come up a lot. I'm going to use that nomenclature very specifically. How thick is your board means literally, what is that thickness? Not how wide is the piece that you've been processing, right? Just to make sure that we're clear on that. So why does this matter? Well, it matters for lots of reasons. One, it's easier for us to kind of be on the same page in terms of how we're talking about the material, but also because wood is sold in units of volume referred to as board feet. Wood is sold by the board foot. It frequently is abbreviated to be like that, board feet, or BF, depending. It is a unit of volume equal to 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch. That is 1 board foot. 1 board foot. So how do I figure out how many board feet are in a really random ass piece of wood, like 50 by 5.5 by 4/4? Well, fortunately, there's a very handy, if not a little bit complicated, equation that you can run it through. And it looks like this. It's length in inches times width in inches times thickness in whatever inches divided by 144. That is going to tell you how many board feet is in a given board. That equation is also sitting inside the wood room, so if you need to do the math to figure out how much something's going to cost, it'll be there. So length by width by thickness divided by 144. If for whatever reason length here is in feet and not inches, you just divide it by 12. But length by width by thickness divided by 144. So somebody want to pull out their phone and run this calculation for me? I don't care who. So 50 times 5.5 times 1, essentially. Or I usually just leave it off if it's 4/4. Actually, you know what? Let's make it 8/4. Let's make it 8/4, so it'll be 2 inches.
Uh, 3.82.
3.82. So a board that's 50 by 5.5 by 8/4 has 3.82 board feet in it. 3.82 board feet. Why does this matter? Well, different species cost different amounts per board foot. So if you don't have a lot of money, you're going to want to look at the board foot cost. So if this is poplar, for example, 8/4 poplar, if memory serves, is like $2. Well, 2 times 3.82 is not much. It's under 10 bucks, right? Babinga, on the other hand, is $13 a board foot. So 3.82 times 13 is a heck of a lot more. I'm not going to do the math in my head right now, but you know what I'm saying. So the cost per board foot is going to change depending on the species. And that has mostly to do with supply and demand in terms of scarcity of materials. Walnut, for example, tends to be a lot more expensive because it's much scarcer. That which is imported from overseas tends to be a lot more expensive. I think I only have 3 what are considered to be 3 exotic hardwoods in there. I've got Babinga, Wenge, and Sapele. And they're, wow. I have mahogany too, but I hate mahogany. I used to love mahogany. It used to be the best wood ever until there was an embargo placed on it, and we can't get it from Honduras anymore. Honduran mahogany is the most beautiful thing in the world, and African mahogany, which is what they sell as mahogany now, is vile and terrible. And I wish I was exaggerating, but it's disgusting stuff. So anyway, that's what goes on here. So, make sense to everyone? Yes? All good? All right, board feet, length, width, inches, blah, 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 da-da-da-da-da. Well, you know, let's take like 5 while my brain regroups. I am not sure if I'm going to keep going with where I would normally go next, because we do have people missing. But yeah, let's take 5. And if I can figure out a way to give you a little bit more information, I will do that. Otherwise, we will wait until Tuesday. All right? Ugh.